Hello, good evening. Welcome to our today's session of documenting the war Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. As you know, the last 2 weeks we had lectures from historical and media studies perspectives. Today we will talk about the documentation of war in sociology and urban studies. And I'm very happy about the participation of our guest today, Natalia Otrishchenko from Lviv, and the moderator, Andrei Vazyanau. Before Andrei introduces Natalia, I would like to briefly introduce him. Andrei Vazyanau received his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Regensburg in Germany in 2018. And since then, he has been a lecturer of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the European Humanities University, which is in Vilnius, Lithuania. And his research includes urban ethnographies in the Donbass in Ukraine, but also in Romania and Belarus. And he is especially interested in questions of mobility, time use, and soundscapes. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited about our today's session. The webinar floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Silvia, for this introduction. And it will be my pleasure to moderate this meeting. And I'm happy to introduce Natalia Otrishchenko to you. We know each other actually for many years. Although due to different circumstances, we do not meet offline that often. We would like to see each other more often. Natalia Otrishchenko is a research fellow at the Center for Urban History in Lviv, Ukraine. And also she is an associate researcher at the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. She holds a PhD in sociology from year 2015 from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And Natalia has been conducted many interesting projects also in the field of urban sociology. One that I'm especially a fan of is the project about balconies in the cities. That since the start of Russian invasion of Ukraine, like many other researchers, Natalia Otrishchenko had to change her working lot radically, and she is now a principal investigator of the project that she is going to talk about. The project Testimonies from the War, 24th February 2022, 5 a.m. So this fall, she is a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Department of Sociology at Columbia University. So she will be broadcasting from afar. Natalia is interested in sociological research methods, oral history and urban sociology, spatial and social transformation after state socialism. And today Natalia is going to talk about what does it mean to collect stories amidst the war, what does it mean for interviewer, and what does it mean for narrators. We'll be happy to answer your questions to Natalia. Natalia will do this, of course. I'll have mine probably. If you have questions, please type them into Q&A box. I will read them aloud. And there is a possibility of feedback, so please be active, interact with us. And I'm now giving the floor to Natalia. Please start.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you, Sylvia, for having me here at this event. And thank you all for joining the conversation about the way how we as researchers and as citizens can contribute to preserving this very difficult and unique moment of life which we are coming through. Let me start from a brief note on positionality. As Andrei mentioned, I am sociologist by my professional background, and I did my PhD in methods and methodology of sociology. Since 2012, I am collaborating with the Center for Urban History, which is a privately funded academic NGO located in Lviv. In the center, we are engaging in the field of urban studies of the region. We are doing digital history. We are engaging in numerous educational programs, and we do what you might call the public history. So we do believe that science could and should be done not only for the sake of itself, but for the sake of the community, which we as scholars do represent. And therefore, these multiple responsibilities that we have, they become extremely visible during the last months after the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. At the center, we do have some experience of rapid response methods, what I might call. The way how we as scholars could mobilize our professional skills and contribute to the preservation of the moment from the point of view of historians, sociologists, anthropologists, architects. Therefore, back in 2013, together with other colleagues at the center, we start interviewing people on the streets in Lviv, Kyiv, and Kharkiv who were actively protesting against Yanukovych regime, who decided to suspend the agreement with the European Union. We conducted two waves of this interviewing in December 2013 and in February 2014, right before the radical escalation on the streets, which resulted in the death of more than 100 people. So actually, back then, we had this experience of thinking a bit ahead and deciding how can we be more reactive toward the events that happen in our country. Also, back in 2020, when the COVID pandemic started, together with the center's team, we did numerous documentation projects related to the documentation of the first months of the COVID pandemic. So building on this experience, we decided that we probably could and should somehow engage into documentation of the current stage of the war, which actually started back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and fights in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. When on February 24th, I was away from Ukraine. I was on my vacations, and it took me a few days to come back to my native city, Lviv. And these few days were full of despair and the feeling of helplessness. They were one of the most difficult days in my life, and similar as a few days ago when the massive shelling of Ukraine happened, and when for a few hours I had no contacts with my relatives, and I have no idea what happened. And I know that there was an electricity and water shortages. So now the war comes in a completely different stage of massive attacks on critical infrastructure, and we see how it develops. But back then, it was also the feeling of uncertainty and the feeling that no one could actually predict how far it will go. But still, we have to mobilize ourselves. And first, we have to secure our lives and the lives of our loved ones. And then we have to react somehow as human beings to help those who are in need. Therefore, part of the center's facilities were turned into a shelter to host people who had to flee the affected regions. It was one of the first things that we can do. We have to secure our materials, our data, our resources, and we have to provide immediate help to the people in need. So balancing these different ways, how we can react as human beings, but also as scholars. In early March, we started to discuss the way how we can actually engage as scholars. It was also a form of the resistance. It was also a way to claim back our future, because all the time research is focused on the future. Even though we have some decisions in the present moment of time, we still think about the future, the way how this story that we collect and preserve would live in the future. And there are numerous questions that scholars have to answer when they decided that they want to engage professionally into the documentation of the war. And the key question, especially when you are engaging in interaction with another human being, is related to the need of the person. And the whole idea of not harming anyone is very crucial and omnipresent in the field of oral history, sociology, and anthropology. But how this harm is actually conceptualized, it's a quite different thing. And we can discuss it during the Q&A. What does it mean, do no harm? To whom, when, how, at what point of time? Do not harm not only through the interaction with the person, but also through the preservation of the stories, through making the stories available to a wider audience. So thinking about these multiple responsibilities that we have towards other people whom we are engaging in the process is very crucial. And it is something that I do believe every initiative has to start with. So does it actually help? And as we start the project, we believe it does. I do believe in the healing function of storytelling, but at the same time, it is very easy to be tempted in the idea that you could be a healer. No, you are not. You are not a healer. You are not a psychotherapist. And the way how you set up the boundaries of your own role in relation to different audiences is very important here as well. So the way how you can help is important. Simply creating this space when another person could express himself or herself, I do believe it's already some kind of a help. As I mentioned, we organized a shelter at the Center for Urban History. And there we were actively engaging in conversations with people, informal ones for sure. We do not record this conversation, but through this informal conversations with people at the shelter and with people at different locations where we engaged as volunteers, we found the urgent need to being heard and the urgent need to contribute to something bigger. And there I can link to the third question, how it is different from journalism and different fields which actually do record stories. Documentation, which is related to archiving the story and is built on the tradition of oral history. It's different, first of all, in terms of the way, what kind of interaction you create with a person. You expect to have the story, you expect to preserve it, and you expect to preserve it in full. Unlike in journalism, where you actually take the experts, the quotes usually, you intersect the full narrative into a set of most telling ideas from another person's experience, and you almost immediately communicate it to the wider audience. In case of oral history, it operates differently. First, you preserve the full story of a person with as much context as possible. And second, you do not make it accessible immediately. Still, you need some kind of time in order to transcribe the story, to provide the metadata, and then to decide the way how it would be accessible. And we can talk about that a bit later, closer to the end of my presentation. So what I want to say here is that every field has its own rules. And depending on the way how the field itself constructs its own rules, we can organize our own work and contribution. And interview is a story for two or even more. Usually it happens as an interaction between the interviewer and narrator, and the way how receiving the stories connected to the war and violence by another person is also extremely important. The way how you create your own team and how you take care of the psychological well-being of people who are engaged in this type of initiative is also crucial. In order to receive the stories, you need to have resources, psychological, emotional. And that's why it's also very important to see the contribution of the team and the way how interviewers themselves feel through the process of active engaging into the life of another person. But also transcribers. We usually do not see this part of the story within a documentation initiative. But if you think that the interview has to be transformed from the spoken language into a written one, there is another person who is actually alone with the voice of a narrator, and who has to deal with also quite different emotions in the process. Therefore, if you think about design of this type of initiative, you have to consider different parties who are engaged. And last but not least, how is it done well? Any type of a project could done poorly. Any type of initiative could hurt people. It doesn't matter, do we speak about the current war or the events which happened many years ago, but still it is very important to be cautious about the possible psychological, emotional, legal outcomes of the story being narrated, being preserved, and being accessed. Therefore, we have to reconsider altogether the criteria, what we might call the validity and reliability, the terms that came from quite a different field, usually in quantitative studies, and how they are applicable to the qualitative one. It is also part of our discussion, the way how we actually prove to ourselves and to the larger community the quality criteria of our initiative. And to the initiative itself, as I mentioned, we started to discuss the way how we can actually contribute to documentation of the war being ethically and methodologically well-grounded. It started from Zoom discussions. Number of calls and emails we did within the team, the core team of the initiative, which represented by the Center for Urban History, other colleagues in Poland, the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, and Polish Society for Oral History, but also with support from the University of St. Andrews in Great Britain and the Center for Contemporary and Digital History in the University of Luxembourg. With this support, we actually designed the initiative on multiple levels. First, our colleagues from the University of St. Andrews, they set up the series of seminars with scholars who are engaging in the research of violence and trauma all around the world in different contexts. And it proved to be kind of an ethical committee, where we, in a form of a discussion, share some of our questions and concerns with the audience of professionals who are doing, if not the same, but similar things and have similar ethical concerns as we do have. For instance, we talked to Ivana Macek, who did the anthropology of wartime Sarajevo, or Nerina Weiss, who interviewed torture survivors in Eastern Turkey. We talked to people who worked in Rwanda, in South Sudan, in Iraq. Therefore, we had this very diverse geography of professionals from different backgrounds who did interviews in heavily affected regions. And with the support of the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, we started to think intensively about the security of the data. Because when you are collecting stories of people amid the war, you will for sure receive an information about military activities. You might receive information about people being under occupation. You might receive information which could be considered highly sensitive. And therefore, securing this data is crucial. And we engaged in intense discussion about the backup of the data and the way how we can store it ethically and with respect to the whole law on personal data security. And other colleagues in Poland, they did engage in conducting interviews themselves with Ukrainian refugees, mainly women, who left Ukraine since February 24th. It wouldn't be possible without support of numerous initiatives who funded scholars at the center. In our team, we do have scholars who are themselves internally displaced. And we can talk about it as well. How those people who do have the experience of being relocated due to Russian aggression, and they helped a lot in terms of designing the questionnaire and the whole methodology itself, which would be respectful to the experience that they have themselves. And also with this funding, it was possible for us to do transcribing, to do field work, to do field trips outside Lviv as well. And since OTEP, we do have support from the House of European History and the Foundation for Polish Science. Here you can see the link to the web page where you can have more information about who are engaged and how. and also access the whole information on the seminars that we held within our initiative. Last but not least, within our Lviv team, we are in the same space, and it was possible for us to meet every week with the support of psychologists. And I have to stress it quite clearly, you do need psychological support in this type of initiatives, because as I mentioned, different people have different abilities to receive stories. And like the rule that you always hear at the airplanes, you have to help yourself in order to help other people later. Therefore, you cannot conduct interviews well and prove that not making any harm to other person when you are themselves broken or emotionally exhausted. On the short-term perspective, and now I will run a bit faster because I have discussed the whole architecture. So now I will go into some of the details. Why we start doing this documentation? First, we had this feeling of other people's need to tell their stories, and these stories being part of something bigger. People had a need for justice, but we are not lawyers. And as I mentioned, setting up boundaries is quite important here. So you cannot promise that their stories will immediately come to the international tribunal, because there has to be a special procedure for that. But at the same time, people do have feeling of living within history quite clearly. And therefore, they wanted their stories to be part of this larger history. And we, as scholars who are dealing with digital humanities and academic studies, we know how important the sources are. And for us, it is also a story of agency. We don't want to label people as vulnerable or traumatized, even though they are often vulnerable, they are often traumatized, but we are not medical specialists to put these labels on people. And I do believe that we cannot take the agency from people who wanted to tell their stories. And also we decided to focus on everyday experiences, because it is something which is so omnipresent and so invisible at the same time. We decided to focus on the way how people experiences the first months of the war, and not to focus clearly on the emotions that they felt. At least we do not ask about it explicitly, because emotions are still a big part of the story, and you cannot separate it from the everydayness itself. But in our conversation, we focused mainly on everyday actions, what people see, what people heard, what people do. It was the main focus. We wanted to grasp this omnipresent reality in order to assess this later, before this official ways of narration are established. In a long-term perspective, we want to develop ethical archiving and access practice as part of this initiative, because we understand how emotionally loaded the stories are, and we don't want to harm people with unethical preservation. And what I mean by that, I want to state it quite clearly. We are practicing approach described by Michael Frisch's shared authority. And we have informed consent as one of the guiding documents, which somehow navigates our responsibilities towards our storytellers and their rights to their own stories, and the way how the stories could be preserved on terms of anonymization, on terms of the ways where the stories are preserved, and on the terms how they could be used in the future. We see it as an important resource for academic community and beyond, because it is actually the essence of oral history. People do share the stories to be heard and to be accessed, not to be stored in the shell. And we do believe that with this stories from the first person, it is possible to contribute to more nuanced history writing in the future. It was possible to do because we had this time of emergency. When this feeling of urgency created, I really love this quote by Mary Marshall Clark, who did herself a research on 9/11 in the New York City. Because you do believe that it is important to do the things right now, with quite limited resources, you can do amazing things. you can mobilize yourself, really, really forward something you see as important. You see it as important for academic community, but also for a larger society, which will need to tell its own story from its own perspective. And for me, it is also a clear statement of subjectivity of society and subjectivity of a person whose life was heavily altered, who might experience numerous losses, but at the same time who has control over his or her own story. Now some practical stuff, how we did it. We decided to record interviews first in Lviv, and the decision is based on some kind of a risk assessment that we have. All Ukraine is affected by the war. And there is no safe space per se, because rocket could target any space. And we used to live with air alarms constantly. But thanks to Ukrainian armed forces, the front line is far from Lviv. And therefore, people do consider this space as safe, and therefore they fled to western part of Ukraine mainly. And decision where to record these interviews is also kind of the one where you have to navigate between multiple risks. We decided not to conduct interviews in Kharkiv and in Kyiv in March because of the high risk for security of both narrators and interviewers. We for sure did not conduct interviews under occupation for multiple of security reasons and also ethical ones. We did not engage in interviews with military people, also because of the information that might be classified. They're not allowed to share. We don't want to put them on risk. Therefore, we focused on recording stories of people who are themselves internally displaced and who are volunteers, whose lives also changed because of the war and who have to reconsider their professional activities quite differently. So where to conduct this interview could be quite a big question, because for oral history tradition, the home is the most important place where you can actually record a person's testimony. But those people do not have homes, or their homes are far. So where actually can you conduct these interviews is a big question for the initiative like this one. We are lucky to have our facility available. We have a library, which was heavily used for as a space for meetings with people, and another center of offices were also used as a space where we can engage in the conversation. During the summertime, we also met outside of buildings, like in open areas, in cafes, so different places where you can meet with a person. But the most important thing is that it is his or her decision of your storyteller, where and when to meet. We have to be really sensitive towards different emotions which people experience within the war and different vulnerabilities that I mentioned. Therefore, it was very important to have this intense pre-interview conversation. How I did it personally. So first, if I know that there is a person who is interested in providing his or her testimony, I wrote to him or her on social media with very general information about the initiative, and ask to provide the contact and time when I can call a person, the time which is the most convenient for him or for her. And then when a person replies, I will call her or him at the set up time and tell more about the initiative itself. And I will share the information that I have, and I will also share the uncertainty that I have, because we cannot promise so many things to our storytellers. We have no idea when and how the war will end. We have no idea how the technology will develop. And I really like the quote by Stephen Naron, who is the head of the Fortunov video archive of the Holocaust testimonies. During one of our seminars, he mentioned that the testimonies of the Holocaust survivors, which were collected in 80s and 90s, those people, they have no idea about the internet possibilities, which we have now. Therefore, the way how the technology will develop it's also a big part of the story. And how much information can be traced from these interviews based on these technological developments? So it is really important for us to make people as informed as possible about the multiple consequences this interview can have on them immediately in the moment of recalling, but also afterward when the story is preserved and become part of the archive. We talk only to adult people who are not related to us. So we do not talk to people who live in our apartments, for instance, whom we hosted ourselves. So we don't want people to feel themselves obliged to share. And we use snowball sampling. We advertise it on social media, and we also have some kind of soft quotas. We wanted to talk to both males and females, people from different age and different professional backgrounds. Therefore, diversity might be the keyword here. So we wanted to make this group of people as diverse as possible in order to collect different stories. We share the topics of interview in advance, so person can be prepared to the way how the interview will go. These topics are related to everydayness, as I mentioned, and the interview is built chronologically. So first we ask a person to tell about himself or herself as much as he or she decides as possible. Then we ask about the pre-February month. Then we focus on a specific day, February 24th. Then we ask about the life afterwards, the changes that happened in everydayness and also in the city and the location from where the person comes. Then we ask to elaborate on the decision to leave, if it is a person who is internally displaced. And then we talk about the way how the life is organized in the new place. And at the very end, we ask a bit about the feeling of the space and feeling of time, how it's different now after the full-scale invasion. But at the same time, this structure is very flexible. So the most important thing that it is narrator-driven, and we really focus on the way how person decided to lay his or her story. We do not push into topics which a person don't want to cover. And we had quite clear instructions for interviewers to ask a person if he or she is ready to talk about specific issues, if a person shows some very intense emotional reactions. We can stop interview at any point of time, we can postpone it. So the person's well-being was, during the conversation especially, was the key. And we try to convey this information really clearly. And we also have this trauma-informed approach. And the word trauma is often used and misused in this type of scholarship. But at the same time, we have to understand that we are stepping in the field of very difficult emotions, some of which might have not been labeled yet academically. And we have to be really cautious to another person's well-being in order not to re-traumatize, not to push into distress or heavily dissociation. And therefore, we also had training with psychologists what to do in different, if we see the sites of dissociation, for instance. And the debriefing after interview was really, really important. So we talk informally about the way how person felt, and also chat about the plans for the day. Usually it was really a crucial thing to return into present and also return to the situation where a person has at least some kind of control over his or her life and the decision that he or her made. As I mentioned, informed consent is a very important tool for us to navigate this relationship with a storyteller. And it is reversible. And it is something that we state quite clearly, that a person can withdraw a consent at any point of time. We don't want to exploit someone's vulnerability and don't want to be extractive in terms of data. We do believe that if these people need to share the stories, we have to assist them, not to misuse this very genuine need to speak. We also want to revision sensitive data with narrators. What I mean here is that after the interview is conducted and we have a transcription, we can check on the different types of data which might be considered as sensitive by the law itself, and then return to the narrator with the idea that we know that this type of data is considered sensitive. Do you still want it to be preserved? So we don't want it to be our decision to remove part of the material, but to make a decision of a person. And we just try to make this decision informed based on the experience that we have in academia. And we are also responsible for ethical treatment of personal data. As we are collaborating in this international framework, we do rely on GDPR, and we do rely on Ukrainian law on personal data. Therefore, like, digital security is very important in this story, and I can speak about that as well. Where are we now? We collected over 150 testimonies already during the 6 months from mid-March to mid-September. We are now, like, the majority of the stories are already transcribed, and we are now developed a system of metadata and indexing. And we are planning a second interview. And it is super important thing that I have to mention. With every person with whom we conducted interviews now, we invited him or her for the second meeting. And I use the formula when the hot phase of the war would be over. And I don't know when it will happen and what we can consider the end of the hot phase, but we do want to have the second interview in order to see the story as something that continues, and also to review the first interview in terms of the sensitive data that I mentioned. The future of documentation. And to do these interviews is only a part of work. And often it is like a very important part, but at the same time, very many decisions come after. And to make the stories visible to wider audience, to make them part of the larger narrative, it is the key concern of any project which deals with personal testimonies. So it's not only about collecting and preserving the stories, it's about the multiple ways how these narratives could become part of the larger storytelling about the war we are facing now. So we have decided on the archiving, what kind of digital environment we should use in order to preserve this data. And there are multiple decisions and multiple options that we can use. We have to decide when actually these materials could be available for different audiences and where, in Ukraine, outside Ukraine, who can have this access and how. Those are numerous questions and we are posing them, but we still do not have any answers. And it is something that we are going to discuss at our in-person meetings that we will have within our initiative this November. I think the issues of archiving and access would be the key issues to discuss. And also, like, my key concern is what kind of the narratives we are going to build based on these stories. Exactly the thing that I mentioned on previous slide, like how make these stories visible, how make them part of the history of this war, history told from the first person who did experience this war on the ground and whose life was extremely changed because of the Russian aggression. So thank you so much, and I am ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Natalia, for this presentation. It looks like nothing I have heard because the circumstances are unprecedented. Thank you for exposing this large body of work, of labor behind the creation of this archive. And also, thank you for touching upon the topic of care. Care not only about the storytellers, but also about interviewers, because people who collect stories in this case are also vulnerable. I'm inviting the audience to ask questions. So far, I don't see any in our questions and answer box. And while you are formulating your questions, I will use the opportunity and ask a question from myself, maybe. One first question, I mean, I'm also an anthropologist who is doing interviews, and I'm interested about the kitchen, so to say. How how often do people refuse to be interviewed, and on which stages of your communication they happen to do so?
The stage of pre-interview usually, like when you started to convey all the possible risks that this narration could pose on people. And usually like refusal happen in different ways. Sometimes people just disappear from communication and we do perceive it as a refusal, but we do not push anyone into an interview. And it is the key concern. So not to make people engage into something that they don't want to engage in. That's why it's quite different from the other projects, oral history project that you might think about, for instance, focused on the Second World War. And when you come to a small village, when you have just a few possible witnesses of the event that happened during the war, and you're really interested in getting their stories. That's why you're really pushing them and trying to convince them to deliver the narrative. But here we are not having this type of strategy at all. So we are not pushing anyone into this initiative. So people do refuse on the level of a pre-interview. And like when you are telling all these possible risks that it might have. And there might be different reasons for people to refuse. But at the same time, we do not have any refusal during the interview or after the interview, at least from the thing that I know. No one actually withdraw his or her informed consent yet. And I hope it will not happen in the future. But we also foresee this possibility as well. So people can withdraw their consent at some point of time, for instance, when we contact this person for a second time. It could be something that we can experience.
So actually, we can say that people are not reluctant to talk, and that actually in some other projects, sometimes people refuse to be interviewed more often than this time, which can also be interpreted as a demand for storytelling from Ukrainian people.
Yes, and we are living in a completely different media environment when the stories are circulating everywhere, and therefore people do see themselves as actors of history. And I think also it is an important change that happened. And it is something that I also can see from the content of these interviews. So people say it quite clearly that we do see it as historic experience, and we do want the history of this event include our experiences, not be written by someone in the ivory tower, but through the perspective of people who did experience this event.
Thanks. We have now two questions in our question and answer box. The first question is from Sarina. Sorry if I'm misreading the names. So I'm reading. Thank you for your important work and interesting presentation. Do you think there is an urgency to collect these testimonies now, or would it be better to wait for people to hopefully return to their homes and conduct the interviews there? So, yeah.
Yes, it would be a different project then, completely. And I do believe that we will have so many of this type of initiatives. And we do already have interviews with people who return to Kyiv, for instance, to their homes. But it's very interesting to see how the memory works. And I can also observe it from my side. It's extremely difficult to return in March, even in my personal timeline. And my everydayness from March and April almost disappeared. And because of these narratives, it was possible to grasp it. It was possible to get the things which are now packed into boxes, which probably will not access anymore. And to see the way how people speak about the time, for instance, and how they relate on dates. The first interviews that we conducted, people do consider the numbers since the full-scale invasion, for instance, day 9, day 12, as a marker in their story. Then we switch into weeks. So it happened on the second week, on the third week, and then we are switching into months. So the way how human memory operates, we see that it wouldn't be possible to access certain types of stories in the future. And I do believe that people who are extremely traumatized, and I'm using this word traumatized here like very strictly with all this medical sense that it had behind, they will never agree to tell the story. And it doesn't matter how much time will pass. Will it be a week, a month, a year, 10 years? Some people will not tell their stories at all. And it is something that we can see also like in other type of environments when the extreme violence was in the past. There are people who just simply cannot engage in this type of initiative, and we have to be cautious about it as well.
Thank you. I'm reading the next question, and actually there are new questions appearing. So the next is from Ninetta. Sorry, it was a bit quick for me, and maybe it was already said, but how did you choose the people that do the interviews? So interviewers. Did you work with filmmakers, or what skills were you mainly looking for?
Yeah, thank you. It's a super important question, and sorry for being quick. Well, we have a team of interviewers, which is a stable one. We rely on the expertise we have at the center. So at the Center for Urban History, we do have historians who have experience in public history, in interviewing, and in work with the context of violence and trauma. So it is really important that the person is sensitive towards the topics he or she is going to hear about. That's why previous experience is very important, and previous experience in interviewing as well. So at the Center for Urban History, we had a call for scholars who are themselves internally displaced and who seek support, because as you might know, there are numerous initiatives aimed to support Ukrainian scholars abroad. And there were numerous initiatives like Scholars in Risk, etc. But we decided like that through the center, we have to support people who stay in Ukraine, who have no possibility to leave for various reasons. Either males who are not officially allowed to leave the country because of the governmental decision, or females who might have family obligations and also cannot leave the country. That's why we do have this program, and thank also to support for numerous initiatives, among which the IVM initiative, who did support people doing documentation in relation to the center. And therefore, we also choose people based on the motivation letters that they wrote to us. And those are people who do have experience in oral history interviewing and do have experience in talking about violence and war. So these were two the most important selection criteria, because like I do not think that it is possible to learn doing interviews based on this type of circumstances. You do need to have skills already, which you can master for sure. And that's why we also have trainings for interviewers, for instance, the ones that I mentioned with psychologists, and how can we react when we see the situation of a distress, among other things.
Thank you. The next question is from Olena. Olena is actually asking the thing I also wanted to ask. So thank you, Olena, from me as well. Dear Natalia, thank you very much for your talk and the project. Have you had any reflection about gender aspects of conducting these interviews? At least, I suppose that the majority of the interviewers are women. What about conducting interviews with men, for example, dealing with an issue of sexual violence and or sexualized tortures against them? Do you have men interviewers?
Yes, we do. We do have male interviews in our team, and we do have female interviews in our team, and it is a big luck for us. Actually, that's why we have this balanced, more or less balanced gender team. And we are not engaging in the issues of sexual violence, for instance, directly. There are for sure questions of hygiene, which would be difficult for some people to discuss with a person from another gender. But still, like, as we have weekly meetings with psychologists, and there we discussed numerous issues which arose during the situation of interviews, like this intergender relations was never raised. And at least it wasn't something that was seen as problematic for team itself. And also, I could see a problem of intergender relations when it comes to interviewing in unsafe environment. For instance, when you are like inside the house with a person who might have a PTSD and who can react aggressively. But as we conducted those interviews mainly in open areas, or at the Center for Urban History, it was safe, at least in terms of environment. So I really hope that we did not endanger anyone from our team directly into the conversation, which could be problematic for them. And I do think that the gender issue is a big question which we have to discuss and reflect on. And I do think also in our case we can do that because we have this bi-gender team.
Thank you, Natalia. There is a question from our chat that is not in Q&A box, so I'm reading them just as they appear. Valeria is waiting. Thank you for your presentation and work. Will you go directly to Western media with some parts of the interviews?
No, no, it is not the intention actually. And as you might say, I'm not even quoting those interviews too much now, because I still do think that working with the content of the stories, we need to get some time to reflect on them and to organize them properly in terms of ethical preservation. And then in case we have this second consent from a person and we know that these materials could be of a certain interest for Western media, then for sure we can advertise the collection itself, but not coming with like a quote, a big quote to someone, because I do not think that it is ethical approach, first of all, like to intersect and just to select something which is visible and screaming into you. I'm not sure if it is the right way to work with these materials, but one more time, it's just my perspective as a person being heavily insider.
Thank you. The next question, I think we will have to ask a person to detailize a bit, to clarify the question. I'll read it aloud. Are you planning to interview also people from the Russian side? Because I'm sure there is a whole variety of different opinions and people get affected differently from the ongoing conflict. Including this perspective, in my opinion, would surely help to draw a more complete picture of the whole war. I do not understand which group of people is meant in the question. Could you please, Christopher, type, do you mean people who were escaping from occupied territories via Russia, those people who escaped from Ukraine via Russia, or those who decided to stay in Russia after escaping occupied territories? Or you mean someone else? I'm sorry to intervene, Natalia. Maybe you understood the question more univocally, but I have doubts on what is meant in the question.
Well, we do interview mainly people who reside in Ukraine at the moment of full-scale invasion. So not Russian citizens from Russia who live in Russia, actually, but we do have people who are from Russian nationality in our sample, for instance, but who are Ukrainian citizens in terms of living in Ukraine at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, like Russian ethnicity, sorry, not nationality, Russian ethnicity, but Ukrainian citizens. And they live in very different parts of Ukraine as well. So we focus solely on this group. And I do understand that there could be multiple projects, different projects, focused also on people from Belarus who escaped the country as well, or people from Russia who escaped forced mobilization. But it could be a different project. And every project is limited to some extent, and AVA is limited only to people who were affected in Ukraine because of the Russian aggression, not outside it.
Yes, thank you. I think Christopher will ask another question if you did. So
Russian citizen, not Russian citizens, not people who live in Russia. As for February 24th, for sure. I do think that there are already some of the initiatives targeting on this group, but we are solely focusing on people who do live in Ukraine at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But they are, as I mentioned, of different ethnicities. So there are Jewish people, Ukrainian people, people of Russian origin. So they are different in ethnic terms, different in religious terms, different in terms of gender, profession, and age. So we try to be diverse in this extent, but only people who are affected by the Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Thank you for clarification, Christopher, and thank you for answering, Natalia. And we're proceeding to a question from Matthias. Thank you very much for your talk. You said you are not pushing people to where they do not want to go in the interviews. But what about logical and narrative consistency? Is there at all an effort on part of the interviewers to push for consistency?
We have this very general structure of the interviews that I mentioned, which is built chronologically and with a focus on everydayness. And there are certainly some questions that interviewers can ask, like supporting questions, supporting to the narrative and supporting to certain topics. For instance, when we talk about everydayness after February 24th, we can ask about food supply. We can ask about communication networks, how people stay connected to their loved ones. We can ask about the way how profession changed. So everything that we conceptualize as part of everydayness. And we can ask these extra questions. But, well, consistency is not something that we are aiming here. So in terms of every person answering exactly the same questions, it is not the strategies that we imply. But at the same time, having this methodology as open as we try it to make allowed us to explore so many different topics which were not inside the questionnaire per se, but do emerge. Like the issues of identity, they're everywhere there. What actually constitutes your identity? Relation to the space, social networks, the usage of language, and the way how people switch in different languages, and the whole decision to provide this narrative and the testimony in specific language is itself very important and quite telling decision. Like there are so many different topics which we can explore because we made this methodology open. And therefore, I do believe that the scholars from the future me maybe, and maybe other generations of scholars who will work with this material, they will find it extremely rich in terms of opening various venues for different topics to be explored.
Thank you. We're going to the question by Jovanka Antic. Thank you for your important work and presentation. Do you also conduct interviews with children? If so, is there anything to keep in mind? If no, why not?
No, we are not conducting interviews with children because it's a completely different legal framework. Mainly, in order to conduct interview with kids, you have to have a consent from parents. And it's also a quite different psychological training that you need to have in order to interact with kids, like the skills in pedagogy. And well, it opens a completely different environment. But I have to mention that in Ukraine, we do have the Museum of War Childhood, the institution which specifically focuses on the experiences of kids, first from Donetsk and Luhansk region. So they did interview with these children. I think the institution itself is a part of the museum in Sarajevo, and in Ukraine it was established in 2018. And since then, they actually are engaging in this type of story collection. So if you are interested in this topic, you can explore more their work.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Anne. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Collecting testimonies on ongoing events amidst the war in this case can be difficult because, as you said, you don't know the outcome of the events. I wonder how you anticipate what could be of interest in the future. Could you tell us more about your specific questions on the everydayness of your narrators?
Well, we can anticipate based on our experience that we have now. Like, as I mentioned, we are an academic institution composed of people from different professional backgrounds, historians, sociologists, architects, media scholars. And based on the experience of our previous studies of the context of the war, we do see the certain blind spots in the way how we write the history of the war and the availability of certain types of resources that we cannot rely on. And that's why, like, thinking about this blank spots, we do see that how everydayness is not visible often, and how the story of the war is focused on extreme experiences, which are for sure an important part of the war itself. And that's why we wanted to collect something which is so invisible but so present, as I mentioned. And actually, the whole struggle of human life happens in everyday life. It could be like an important political decision, but at the same time, it's also like part of my general idea of the scholarship. And like, the most important thing actually opened in our everydayness. The things who we are and what we do, and what is really about the changes that happen in our lives. They reflected in everydayness. And that's why I believe that through everydayness, it is possible to access various topics. And just partially, I mentioned them, like the issue of practices, of identity, of solidarity, of agency, of resistance. Like, everything happens through your small actions in your everyday life, and big actions in your everyday life. But still, like, I believe that because of this focus, it is possible in the future have this variety of different research questions. This project hasn't started as a research question per se. We were not guided by the clear-cut question that we have to answer. We just have the feeling of urgency, as one of the questions mentioned, like the feeling of urgency to preserve the moment while it is in the situation of making. And the openness of the future, like, it is something which we are living all the time now, like since pandemic, I believe, and even more, even since 9/11. Like, the future is open to various scenarios, and we have no idea how it will develop. We have no idea about the like nuclear threats which we have now. So but it doesn't mean that we have to stop doing things and to lay down our hands and just think, okay, we can do nothing. We have no agency to predict the future, therefore nothing is important. It was one of the reactions, by the way, on the very first days of the war. I really revisioned all of my work and thinking, okay, is it relevant at all when we have this like straightforward challenge to everything, to your very general existence? But then it is an important like decision of empowerment. When you think, okay, I do that, I'm doing that for the sake of the future, whatever the future can be. And if I'm doing that this way, I do believe that in future, it could be our story. And therefore, I believe that we will have a possibility, we as Ukrainian society, we will have the possibility to tell our story ourselves. Especially now when we have all these challenges of decolonization and the way how the story of Ukraine was told in different institutions through the Russian perspective mainly. And we will need the sources from Ukraine in order to change the situation in the future. And I also believe that it could be a valuable example for other cases, when you do need to work with the situation on the ground and not to rely too heavily on the ready-made context from the outside.
Thanks. There is a greeting and the question. I'm reading the greeting first. It is from Svetlana Voltovska. Dear Natalia, great to see you again, even online. Thank you a lot for your presentation and your work. Hope to see you somewhere offline soon. Maybe do some cooperation again. This is from Berlin. And the question comes from Esther. Are there certain types of information that you miss out on due to your soft approach, not forcing interviewees? Or does this method only bring advantages?
For sure, we are going to miss a lot, and we are completely aware of the thing that like every method will give you something and will not show you something. So it is general about any method you decide to pick for your toolbox. And it is also part of the scholarly reflection to understand what you can and cannot assess because of the decision on the method that you made. For sure, we will not have numerous extreme experiences because we are not focusing on these extreme experiences. At the same time, they are quite visible and present in media. And that's why we decided that there is no other need to collect this type of stories. We have also numerous projects focused on the war crime documentation in Ukraine already, with people who are trained as investigators and who have a very specific procedure to talk with people about the crimes that they witnessed or lived through. It is not our task, and that's why I stated quite clearly at the very beginning. So understanding the boundaries of the work that you can do is also part of this kitchen that you, Andrei, mentioned, like the kitchen of a researcher, to understand the limits of your own method. For sure, we will not have these extremes. And at the same time, I do believe that the scholars who are really interested in these topics, they will have venues where to look for this type of data. And it is not our task to be about everything and to cover everything. We will not have experiences from the occupied territories. We will not have experience from military people now about this forced resistance of Ukrainians. But I think that there will be projects. And it also shows that the numerous possibilities where we can explore as scholars, where we can look with our specific questions. So for sure, we will have something and we will not have something. And it will be also our part to deliver it quite clearly in the description of the collection. It is part of academic honesty to say what you can propose to a scholar and what you can't.
Thank you. And there is another question coming from Matthias. Do you at all include questions about the interpretation of ongoing events, like who is responsible, causes for the war, etc.?
No, we do not include, but people do talk about that a lot. So it is actually the case when you have this open environment and the person can express himself or herself, at some point they will speak about the causes of the war, they will speak about responsible sides, they will name the enemy quite clearly, they will reflect a bit on geopolitical situation. Some people which do need to reflect on that, because there are people who don't need to speak about that, and for them their everyday life is more important than this big political picture. Or they might have any political picture in their head. They can just have the feeling of unjust war that happen upon them. And yeah, we do not intentionally include that, but because I think that it is part already of the scholarly work of like the research that we get used to do when we have a hypothesis and we have a certain questions in order to check that hypothesis. In our case, the primarily task was documentation of everydayness and everydayness of people who are either internally displaced or who are volunteers. So also like these two big groups. And that's why like specific topics for sure were not covered. But at the same time, I think if you are interested in doing a research on the way how people like perceive ongoing events and like think about the causes of the war, you will still find a lot of data in our interviews.
Great. Thank you for all these answers, Natalia. I think what you are telling us is extremely valuable for anyone who is conducting interviews or working as interviewer or designs a research. I learned a lot as well from today's presentation, and I actually still have questions. You mentioned you mentioned interviewers today, and that they have to be cared about. And if I'm not mistaken, you are having a weekly seminar for interviewers at the Center for Urban History. Maybe you could elaborate on the most difficult things or the most significant challenges for interviewers based on your experience on those meetings. What is the most challenging, unexpected, probably?
Yeah, thank you. That's a super important question and also part of our constant reflection. I'll put it like that. People are capable to describe very difficult experiences because they lived through it, and they are able to find words. They are like sometimes more strong than we might think about them. And receiving these things is more difficult when you haven't lived through it. And that's why there are some experiences that could be quite triggering, and every one of us has its own like lines of triggers, which can have a very bad influence on our own psychological well-being. So there are certain stories which stay with us for a long time. And that's why we have this meeting with psychologists where we can have a possibility to discuss the things which stay with us too long. And I do think that the most important challenge and the psychological consequences for us could be the way that we cannot help these people more. That we are speaking with people who are in a very difficult circumstances. Some of them might lose their home, their jobs, their certainty about life. They are facing so many losses, and we are still in a more privileged position than they are. And acknowledging this power imbalance is also very, very challenging and very difficult, emotionally, first of all, and setting this clear lines between where you can help and what can you have more, what kind of relations you can enter with a person, and do you feel yourself obliged to do more. And for us, it was really clear that we are obliged to provide informational support for a person, to give data on different volunteering centers which can help people with supply, information about psychological support, information about interaction with local administration. So just be this informational pillow, but at the same time, do not engage further, because engaging further would have very difficult psychological consequences. So having this boundaries of your profession, where you can help and where you can't help, is also very, very big challenge in this type of work.
Which I can relate to also conducting interviews from Donbass since 2015, which I could only do via Skype, by the way. It's a completely different story. And yeah, I guess it's one of the challenges that interviewers now will have to deal with as well, which effect it has to interview people via digital media or offline. You are now doing this offline, seeing each other completely, so ensuring more trust probably and more comfort to your interlocutors. And I have yet another last question. You've mentioned during your presentation an oral history archive of Holocaust stories. Are there any other examples of oral history archives that you orient the project towards, or would just have affected your approach to work?
This 9/11 project is a very important case for us to relate to, because it was also an example of a rapid response. The Columbia Center for Oral History, they launched interviewing, I think, on the 4th or 5th day after they attacked on the World Trade Center. So it was also like a very quick response to an extremely difficult event for American society. And we are like looking at this project a lot when we are thinking about our initiative. There are also like numerous projects related to Rwanda, but the key difference and like the most important thing for us is this project on 9/11, because we are part of the society which is affected. And that was exactly the case for that type of archive. And it's often not the case for other types of archive, which are created by scholars from the outside who come to the affected areas in order to record interviews. So for us also, there's like this double positionality, being both part of global academia and being really rooted in a very specific context of Ukrainian society, of city of Lviv. Like it has multiple pressures at the same time. Like it was something that I didn't mention during the presentation, but it's something that that was also visible in the questions themselves. Like you have a pressure from academia to have very like strict questions, strict procedures, trying to follow them in order to prove that you are academic enough. And you have a challenge of being in the midst of the war itself, which like lies so many obligations on you in terms of like interactions with people, not harming them, in terms of preserving data, in terms of like security things, like the words which are part of our like methodology textbooks, but which we perceive quite like just as a very general notion. In this case, they are really like embedded things. They're all about flesh. All decisions will have their own consequences, and we have to understand and acknowledge these consequences. So it's a completely different situation for sure. But like Holocaust archives, the archive of 9/11, they are the most important reference points for us.
It's actually a collection of uncomparable cases. Yeah, because you can only put next to the current case that you're working with other cases that are uncomparable. Yeah, and that's a challenge as well, analytically, methodologically, historically. And thank you for mentioning academy, which also has its requirements and standards and its ideas about compliance and so on. Just 2 weeks ago, I participated in a roundtable on another situation and another case, but we also were discussing with colleagues that actually we have to keep in mind the question addressed to us from the future. What have you been doing as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, as a historian during the war, during mass repressions, during the mass exodus or attack on your country? What have you been doing? And it was extremely interesting to listen to one of the answers to that question today. Thank you for this very informative talk and for this very intense Q&A session. Thanks to the audience for asking all these questions, and hope to see you again.
Yeah, I would like also to thank all of you. Thank you, Andrei, for this extremely personal input, and it was lovely to see all of you here. Thank you all for joining, even though I cannot see all of your faces, but I can imagine them still. And probably the last point I would like to make during this this meeting is that doing research is a privilege. And it is something which is extremely visible for me during this last 7-8 months. I can do research because I still have home. My professional life was not disrupted. It was disrupted to some extent, but still it was possible to reorient something and remain in profession. I have electricity, I have water, my family is safe. I can maintain numerous of important connections which constitute my everyday life. And that's why I am responsible to do as much as I can for those who do not have this privilege. And I have this privilege also because of the Ukrainian army, which stands and holds the front and which protects Ukrainian sky and land and water. And that's why I have this privilege. So thank you all, and thanks to Ukrainian army that I am still in my profession and can do this type of project.
Many thanks, and there are also many thanks coming from the chat and from Q&A box. Thank you for this meeting. We are now rounding up. Goodbye.
Bye, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your moderation. Thank you very much.
And many thanks to Natalia. I think it was very intense.
Very informative. Yeah, very impressed by that talk. Thank you, Andrei. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See ya.